Hail peeps, hail peeps, hail peeps. I want to read the end of chapter 7 and 8 of Peter Cushing, an autobiography. Now, Sir Peter was advised to write this book by another great actor, Sir John Mills, who actually said to Sir Peter, "Put your life on paper." So Peter wrote this book, Peter Cushing, an autobiography. Now, this book documents everything from being born right through his life, struggling to make it as an actor. He went to America, one-way ticket to Hollywood, worked with Laurel and Hardy on A Chump at Oxford, which was actually filmed in Hollywood, not Oxford. So he made probably 7 or 8 films in America. And then it goes right through his life, school, rep, everything. And then he met and married his dear wife Helen, who was actually probably the best thing that ever happened to Sir Peter. See, Peter, at the beginning of his career, he was so insecure and he didn't think he had what it takes to be an actor. But Helen knew that somewhere within him he was going to be a fine actor. Especially in the 1950s when BBC television was live, and most actors will all say the same. You know, it was terrifying. It was terrifying. It was. But Helen supported Peter on the set and got him through, you know. And in countless interviews, Sir Peter always said Helen was a big support right through his career. Only but for Helen, he wouldn't have even had a career, you know. So the end of this book is quite sad, really. Quite sad, because when you follow their life together and then it all ends with Helen's passing, you know, you realise you can actually feel Sir Peter's sadness, you know, how he dealt with it all. And I mean, he even cancelled his participation in a 1971 Hammer film, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. He was actually going to star in that movie, but because Helen was so ill, he cancelled his participation in the film. So Andrew Keir, he eventually played the part Sir Peter was going to play. So probably a lot of people didn't realise that. But I mean, all us fans, we know only too well all about Sir Peter and what he went through with the passing of his dear wife Helen. So this is kind of a companion piece for the first video I did on Sir Peter, which a lot of people have actually told me that they enjoyed it very much, you know, because I talked a lot about Sir Peter Cushing in another video I did. So yes, so it was met with rave reviews. So I'm going to read the last page of chapter 7 and then into chapter 8, just to give you an insight into what Sir Peter went through with the passing of his wife. My next film engagement was based upon Robert Louis Stevenson's classic thriller Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with Christopher Lee playing the dual roles. Now this film is actually I, Monster, and it was a 1971 Amicus film. And Christopher Lee wasn't at all happy with this movie at all, because he couldn't understand why the Amicus producers, Milton Subotsky and Max J. Rosenberg, called it I, Monster and changed the characters' names about as well. So he wasn't really pleased with this film, Christopher Lee. You know, and a lot of fans probably can't understand why it was called I, Monster rather than just Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But anyway, so Sir Peter and Christopher was both in this movie. I didn't want to be away from Helen, and rather than risk delays on the long drive to and from the studios each day, I caught the milk train getting home in the evenings about 10 o'clock. Joyce lived in Welling and journeyed down to keep Helen company every morning or afternoon, and I had asked David Clawton, a staunch ally and local electrical wizard, to install a stair lift, as Helen could no longer walk up the flight to our bedroom. Her dedicated breathing exercises were helping her, and she strove so valiantly to master the advised techniques, refusing to accept defeat, until she was told by locum tenens that what she was doing was a waste of time. It was pitiful to see her spirit crumble, and although it wouldn't have made any difference to the inevitable outcome, that slap in the face took the heart out of her and speeded her decline. Her weight went down to 6 stone. I had lost 3 myself, and we were both physically and mentally spent. Early in January 1971, I started a film for Amma at Elstree. Now, this film was actually Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. So, because Sir Peter's wife, Helen, was so ill at this time, Peter had to pull out of this film, but it was actually Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which Andrew Keir took over at late notice. So that's the film what he had to come out of. At the end of the first day, Joyce rang to say Helen had been taken to Canterbury Hospital for a check-up, where she would be kept in for a few days. She looked tired when I got there in the evening, but comfortable enough. I wasn't on call the next day. I promised I'd bring a little picnic lunch for us to have, as a change from hospital fare. She smiled and said that would be lovely. Arriving with the small wicker hamper containing smoked salmon and avocado salad, I went straight to her private ward and stopped dead in my tracks. Hanging over the glass peephole at the door was a notice: no visitors under any circumstances. Numbed with consternation, I sought the sister at once, who took me to the doctor attending Helen. He told me she'd had a relapse during the night. Her chest and heart were very weak, and she had emphysema. My mind switched to Dr. Galasqui. This was the terminal illness he could not work miracles to cure. Something inside me still refused to believe what must have been obvious to everyone else. I knew her invincible will and courage, and had seen her overcome bouts of sickness that would have laid low far more robust individuals. I begged the doctor to let her come home. He agreed to this, pointing out that she would need constant nursing. While she was being prepared for the journey, I arranged for a day and night nurse, and then rang John Redway asking him to cancel my participation in the film. I joined Helen in the ambulance for what was to be our last drive together in this world. There were many times when I have been human and heard, Helen was divine, and forgave, but I could never forgive myself. I spoke about this. Peter, dearest, I told you before we were married I didn't want you to feel possessed. Those things are so unimportant, they don't matter. As far as I'm concerned, they didn't even happen. She took my hand in hers, as soft and delicate as gossamer, and with immutable love whispered tenderly, "You've been wonderful. No one else would have done for me what you have done. I cannot thank you now, because I cannot talk. But I will when I'm better." For a little while she improved, amid familiar surroundings and loving care, but it was only temporary, like an electric light bulb that sometimes seems to glow brighter for a few seconds, just before the filament burns out and is extinguished forever. So, chapter 8. Good night, my beloved Peter. I had gone into the garden to collect some coal from the bunker to put on the fire, and upon my return found Helen sitting hunched on the divan. A dreadful foreboding overcame me, but I tried to conceal my fears. "I can't help you any more, Peter dear," she said. "You help me just by being here," I replied truthfully. "But suppose I'm not here tomorrow?" I forced myself to say lightly, "Why, you're not going anywhere, are you?" "No." She fell silent for a moment and then looked at me. "I shall always be with you. Everywhere, at all time." With a little smile she lay back and closed her eyes. I wrapped a blanket around her, made up the fire, and then went into the conservatory, where I broke down and wept. Maisie had been witness to this and kindly brought me a cup of tea. "Don't give way, sir," she said. "She'll be all right." I heard myself say, "Thank you, Maisie. Yes, she will be all right." I lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and drank the tea. The night nurse arrived promptly at 9 o'clock and helped Helen upstairs and into bed. I soon followed. I kissed her and she whispered, "Good night, my beloved Peter. You will save me. God bless you." These were the last words she ever said. At about 3 a.m. some instinct woke me, and I reached out my hand. I felt her flesh. It was as cold as stone, and had an unnatural clammy dampness to it. I switched on the bedside lamp and the electric blanket. She opened her eyes a little, and I saw that her pupils were just minute black dots. "Would you like a cup of tea, dearest?" She nodded slowly. I helped her to sit up and tucked a pillow behind her back. Then, putting on my dressing gown, went down to the kitchen. The nurse was there, and I asked her if she would go and sit with Helen whilst I made the tea. When I took it up, Helen was lying down again, her eyes open and glazed, her breathing spasmodic and painful to hear. I put the cup on the side table, sat down by the bed and rested my hand gently on her hip. I looked at the nurse, who returned my gaze and slowly shook her head. We sat on either side of the bed in silence for what seemed an eternity. "Is there nothing we can do?" I asked at last. The nurse shook her head again. I had read many times of the death rattle, and when it came it was almost with relief that I heard it. To suffer as she had done for so long was too much to bear, and now the end was near. The nurse must have seen my stricken face, for she warned me, "Don't do anything that might upset her. She is still very conscious of everything that's going on." Helen raised both her arms very, very slowly, as if in supplication and to welcome somebody into them. She remained like that for a long time, then, just as slowly, lowered them. Her eyes closed and her breathing ceased. The nurse leant over her. A few moments passed, and then she said quietly, "She's gone." I glanced at the clock. The hands showed it was nearly 9. I looked down at my darling's face, and as if by some miracle all the pain and suffering of the past years had been wiped away. She looked serenely at peace and quite beautiful. I kissed her forehead and murmured, "My dear Helen." That was all. Drained of all emotion, I felt nothing, just empty, my mind as though anaesthetised. The shock was to come later, much later, with devastating effect. But at the moment all I could think of was that if I were playing this scene in a film, I wouldn't be reacting like this at all. "You'd better get dressed now, Mr. Cushing." The nurse's gentle voice roused me from my reverie. I nodded and did as she bid. Later that morning the undertaker arrived. He was a kindly gentleman, tall and thin, with sleek hair as black as his clothes, and wearing a professionally permanent smile of sympathetic understanding. After a few preliminaries, he opened a brochure, displaying a variety of monumental masonry for me to choose from. Some of them reminded me vaguely of the pictures I'd seen years ago of elaborate jelly moulds in Mother's copy of Mrs. Beeton's recipes. With his palm uppermost, he pointed delicately with the nail of his little finger to one of the illustrations, an open book, and said, "This headstone is very popular in the trade." Trade? What an extraordinary word to use. I thought, well then, I suppose it is a trade, and a brisk one at that. I accepted his choice and asked for a space to be left by the side of Helen's name to allow for mine when that joyous day dawns. Again, with that absurd theatricality at such a time, I said to myself, "You have first billing, dear one." Underneath I requested some lines to be engraved that I had written for her on our silver wedding anniversary in 1968. A quarter of a century, no less. Oh my, but how time flies! It only seems but yesterday. But you, who have so much to give, gives all, and having given wonders in all humility. What is left to give? But Helen dear, the present stands on what the past has taken, and the future holds but good, when in such loving hands and care as yours. I thank God and you for, oh, so much, denied to those less lucky ones than I, because I know that but for you, this world would be a sad and lonely place, and I has nothing in it. I went out onto the deserted beach. It was blowing almost gale force. The seagulls were wheeling and mewing above me, the waves pounding the shingle with a deafening roar. I looked up to heaven and began humming the tune, "Happy Birthday to You." I think I'd gone a little mad. A gust of wind blew a sheet of newspaper towards me, which wrapped itself around my legs. I removed it and by force of habit thrust it into my jacket. not wishing to litter the shore. I found myself indoors again, wandering aimlessly about the house, then suddenly started rushing up and down the stairs as fast as I could in the vain hope of inducing a heart attack. When this subsided, I reached in my pocket for a cigarette and pulled out the paper I'd put there. I looked at it idly. It was a page from the Daily Telegraph, and at the top of the personal column my eye caught the following tracts. Ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no man taketh from you. This windfall was surely something more than sheer coincidence. It was then that I found the letter Helen had left for me. Let the sun shine in your heart. Do not pine for me, my beloved Peter, because this will cause unrest. Do not be hasty to leave this world, because you will not go until you have lived the life you have been given. And remember, we will meet again when the time is right. This is my promise. And Peter says at the bottom, I have been doubtful many times about many things during my life, but of this I have no doubt whatsoever. And that is the end. So, very sad, but those words was a comfort to Peter, and those words kept him going until his own death in 1994. So that is a sad end to Volume 1. The great Peter Cushing.